Recently, Trump privately admitted that his plans for Greenland might never happen. Whatever his exact motivation might be, Greenland has clearly been a major point of interest for him throughout both of his presidential campaigns. But has the United States ever actually controlled this island, as Trump claimed? The answer is a simple no. Still, the US has had its eyes on Greenland for a long time. In this video, we are going to explore this massive piece of land, the history behind America's attempts to buy it, and the biggest question of all, why do Americans want Greenland so badly? To answer that, we need to rewind 1,000 years to see who actually owns it in the first place. Greenland is the largest island in the world, but despite its massive size, it has a tiny population of just around 50,000 people. And despite the name, it definitely isn't green, at least not most of it. Europeans first arrived on this frozen island way back in the Viking Age. It started with Norsemen led by Eric the Red. After being exiled from Iceland, he set foot on this new land and deliberately chose the name Greenland, which means Greenland. He wanted to make the land sound like an attractive destination for new settlers. Fast forward to 1380. The kingdoms of Denmark and Norway united under a single crown. For a long time, they mostly left Greenland to fend for itself. It was massive, freezing, and sitting in an isolated corner of the world. But everything changed as the world expanded. The Danish-Norwegian Union's interest renewed, seeing Greenland as the perfect strategic bridge between Europe and the Americas. When Norway and Denmark finally split up, the sovereignty of Greenland was handed over to Denmark. This is a massive turning point in this story. Why? Because Denmark suddenly claimed ownership of the entire island, even though the vast majority of the north and center was completely unexplored. Fast forward to the mid-19th century. United States was quickly becoming a major player on the world stage. Coming out of the Civil War, America was hungry to expand, but the mainland was boxed in, surrounded by British Canada to the north and Mexico to the south. Luckily for the US, some global empires were willing to trade land for cash. Enter Russia. At the time, the Russian Empire was at its absolute peak in terms of size, but economically and militarily it was struggling. Terrified of losing Alaska to the British in a war, Russia decided to sell it off. The man who handled this deal was US Secretary of State William H. Seward. Back then, people viewed Alaska much like they view Greenland today, a frozen wasteland. Seward was publicly mocked as a fool, and the press pressured more. Seward's Folly, Seward's Iceberg, and a Polar Bear Gardens was the name that they given to him. What most people don't know is that Seward and President Andrew Johnson also had their sights on buying Greenland and Iceland. Unfortunately for them, they couldn't get the political support for the funding. And by the time Alaska finally proved to be a massive treasure of resources, that 19th century dream of an American Greenland had faded away. As the US grew more powerful, it decided to kick off its own exploration in the high Arctic. The strategic goal was to find a northern route to Alaska, essentially boxing in Canada, which was still controlled by the British Empire. This era of exploration was dominated by one man, Robert Peary. His expeditions across northern Greenland sparked a messy web of territorial claims that would complicate US-Danish relations for decades. Peary was a bold, fiercely ambitious guy, born in Pennsylvania and raised in Maine. He graduated with a degree in civil engineering and an absolute obsession with fame. At just 24 years old, he wrote a letter to his mother saying that he refused to die without accomplished something great. Before making history, he bounced around doing odd jobs, working as a taxidermist, a county surveyor, and a draftsman before finally joining the US Navy. He proved so incredibly talented at exploration that his wealthy friends literally created the Peary Arctic Club just to fund him, ultimately bankrolling 8 separate expeditions into the freezing Arctic. During his second major expedition in 1891, Peary's team covered a massive 1,200 miles by dog sled. When they finally looked over Independence Fiord, they proved once and for all that Greenland was an island, not some extension of a massive polar continent. To honor this massive achievement, the vast northern territory was officially named Peary Land. But Peary didn't just map the land, he claimed it. Throughout his travels, he officially staked a claim on huge chunks of northern Greenland for the US. Since Denmark wasn't actively governing or even exploring the freezing northern regions, the US argued that the land was belonged to them by right of discovery. Peary was a genuine visionary. He realized that as technology advanced and the world effectively shrank, Greenland would become incredibly strategic. While Peary's grand ambitions didn't immediately pan out, the US wasn't ready to give up. Right before the outbreak of the First World War, the US ambassador to Denmark actually proposed a massive geopolitical trade, swapping the Philippines for Greenland and the Danish West Indies, which nowadays we know it as the Virgin Islands. Denmark passed on the deal. But as the Great War raged on, in 1916, a new threat emerged. Germany was planning to occupy the Danish West Indies, which would give them a strategic naval base and pose a direct threat to the newly built Panama Canal. To eliminate this threat, the US urgently scrambled to buy the islands from Denmark. The final treaty handed total sovereignty of the islands to the US for a cool $25 million. But there was a massive catch regarding Greenland. To get Denmark to actually agree to the Caribbean sale, the US had to concede. Tucked away in an official appendix to the treaty, the United States formally declared that it would no longer object to Denmark controlling Greenland. The situation lingered for years until outbreak of the Second World War. Exactly as Robert Peary had warned decades earlier, the rapid advancement of aircraft and submarine technology completely transformed Greenland into a vital strategic asset. Even before the US entered the war, American military planners saw this shift coming. While some politicians skeptically claimed the islands was still too far from American shipping routes to matter, the sheer pace of the war forced Washington's hand.
Germany occupies Copenhagen.
On April 9, 1940, Nazi Germany bleeds and occupied Denmark. This catastrophe triggered an immediate crisis in the United States. Military leaders panicked. What if Germans used Greenland as a forward operating base to refuel their deadly U-boats? The security of North Atlantic shipping lanes and the American mainland itself would be in severe danger. Overnight, this frozen island was seen as a giant shield protecting the New World from the Old. To counter this existential threat, the United States had to move fast. In July 1940, President Roosevelt's administration adopted the Act of Havana. This agreement firmly prevented any European territory in the Americas from being transferred to a hostile foreign power. In simple words, the US legally blocked the occupied Danish government from handing Greenland over to Nazi Germany. Exactly a year later, to make sure this protection couldn't be violated, the US signed a groundbreaking treaty with the Danish ambassador in Washington, Henrik Kaufmann. It was officially called the Agreement Relating to the Defense of Greenland. But the Kaufmann Agreement was incredibly bizarre. Why? Because Ambassador Kaufmann went completely rogue. He acted entirely on his own, flat out rejecting orders from the occupied Danish government in Copenhagen, correctly assuming they were being controlled by the Nazis. This rogue treaty granted the US the right to build military, naval, and air bases in Greenland, effectively taking over Ireland's entire defense. In exchange, the US promised to officially recognize Denmark's sovereignty over the territory. Naturally, the government in Copenhagen, acting under heavy German pressure, declared the agreement completely void. And honestly, they were right. Kaufmann had absolutely no authority to give away Denmark's sovereign rights. He signed the paper on behalf of His Majesty the King, which was a total bluff. Despite his intentions, Kaufmann was formally fired from his post and charged with high treason. Having gotten exactly what they wanted, the United States simply ignored the protests coming out of Copenhagen. They rapidly deployed forces, essentially occupying the island in record time to build crucial airfields and Arctic weather stations. Thanks to the rogue Kaufmann Agreement, the US had achieved total de facto military control over Greenland, completely escaping the legal and financial headaches of actually owning it. When Second World War finally ended, Greenland didn't lose its strategic value. In fact, the invention of the atomic bomb and the dawn of the Cold War made it more important than ever. The US military quickly realized that the shortest flight path for bombers and later nuclear missiles traveling between the Soviet Union and the US mainland went straight over the North Pole. Overnight, Greenland became the ultimate front line for America's early warning radar systems. Because of this, the US military was completely unwilling to pack up and abandon the bases they had just built. As a newly liberated Denmark grew increasingly anxious and tried to legally terminate the 1941 Defense Agreement to get their island back, President Truman's administration fired back with a truly radical counter-proposal. In December 1946, during a high-stakes meeting in Washington, the US Secretary of State presented the Danish Foreign Minister with a few options for the island's future. The wildest option, buying Greenland outright for $100 million in gold, roughly $1.5 billion in today's money. The Danish Foreign Minister was completely shocked. He later wrote to the American's ambassador, "While we owe much to America, I do not feel that we owe them the whole island of Greenland." With the buyout rejected, the US settled for the next best thing, securing base rights. By this time, Cold War wariness was gripping Europe. NATO was formed and Denmark signed on as a founding member, firmly locking them into the Western Alliance. But this new alliance made the situation in Greenland even more complicated. In April 1951, secret negotiations kicked off in Copenhagen to officially scrap the rogue Kaufmann Agreement and replace it with a brand new defense treaty. Shortly after, bowing to the immense pressure of the global decolonization movement, Denmark finally stripped Greenland of its colonial status. From then on, the US maintains its grip, though they definitely crossed a few lines. For instance, as the Cold War heated up, Denmark adopted a strict nuclear-free policy. But the problem was that the US military was secretly flying nukes right into Greenland anyway. This terrifying secret exploded into public view in 1968 when a B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashed directly onto the sea ice near Thule Air Base. The massive cover-up wasn't fully exposed until the 1990s. Back on the ground, locals were demanding more control. Their pressure led to Home Rule in 1979, granting Greenland its own parliament, and eventually full self-government in 2009. Exactly 10 years from then, Donald Trump shocked the world by launching a public campaign to literally buy the island, calling it a large real estate deal. His offer was instantly swatted down by Greenland and Denmark, with Greenland's government famously snapping back. "We are open for business, not for sale." Honestly, Trump likely just wanted to drastically expand the US military footprint, but he figured he'd shoot for the total ownership first and try his chance. When Trump won re-election, things escalated fast. His administration took an incredibly aggressive stance, triggering the infamous Greenland Crisis of late 2025. Trump pushed hard and the door was repeatedly slammed in his face. But this is a classic Trump, using the door in the face negotiation tactic. By demanding something large, for example, total ownership, he was trying to force massive concessions. Maybe he never actually wanted the island itself. He just needed expanded access for the US military and his new Golden Dome defense system. And his strategy seemed to work, as the crisis finally began to cool down following a series of agreements struck at Davos in early 2026. So, as we've seen, Donald Trump wasn't the first American leader to dream of buying or even occupying Greenland. This situation has been going on for over 2 centuries. Today, the island is trapped in an incredibly delicate balancing act. On paper, it governs itself under the Danish constitution, but in reality, its defense is entirely anchored by US military. This brings up a massive question. What happens if, as we recently witnessed, a US administration decides to completely ignore those on-paper boundaries? Or on the other hand, what if the people of Greenland eventually decide one day they want the US military out? Would Washington actually pack up and leave? But the deepest tragedy of this story isn't about America or even Denmark. It's about the Greenlanders themselves. For over 2 centuries, massive foreign powers have negotiated treaties, built military bases, and traded their homeland like a chess piece, almost entirely excluding the local population from the conversation. After being sidelined for so long, the ultimate question remains: is true independence for Greenland even possible?